The moment I realized love could be weaponized, I was holding a pen, and nobody in that house knew what I had just done. I signed it at 4:47 in the afternoon. Rennick, my attorney, a man with the blunt jaw of someone who had seen every kind of family disaster a courtroom could produce, slid the folder across the lacquered surface of his desk without ceremony, the way a surgeon might hand a nurse something used. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't warn me. He simply said, "That's it." And I understood that it was enormous, that it would echo through decades, that it would still be vibrating in the bones of people I loved, and people I had stopped loving, long after I was gone. I capped the pen. I walked to my car. And then I drove 40 minutes across the Caraíbe Valley toward my father's house, where 25 members of our family were already seated around a table draped in white linen, unaware that the ground beneath the whole beautiful fiction of us had already cracked. Let me tell you what kind of man my father, Osvaldo, was before I tell you what he became. He had wide shoulders and a gap between his front teeth that he never bothered to fix. And when he laughed, genuinely laughed, not the performer's laugh he later cultivated. The sound was low and accidental, like something falling out of a pocket. He had been a civil engineer for 30 years, designing bridges and retaining walls, things meant to hold weight. He coached my soccer team when I was 9, badly, with absolute conviction. He taught me to drive on a dirt road behind the old processing plant on the edge of our town, Veridal, steering with one hand and pointing at nothing with the other, the way men do when they're trying to look like they're not nervous. He told me once, during a power outage when we sat in the dark eating crackers with margarine, that the worst thing a man could do was pretend a feeling he didn't have. I was 13. I wrote it down in a notebook I still own. I am telling you this because I need you to understand that the man who stood up at that dinner table was not a stranger. He was someone I had studied the way you study something you depend on. And the betrayal, if you can call a pivot that surgical a betrayal, was not the crude kind. It was architectural. It had load-bearing walls. My mother, Delmira, died when I was 22. Pancreatic cancer, swift and merciless, the kind that gives you a diagnosis and a funeral within the same season. She was 51. She had the handwriting of someone who cared very much about being understood. After she died, Osvaldo went gray in 3 months. Not gradually, but as if something inside him had simply stopped arguing with time. He didn't date for 4 years. I respected that silence. Then he met Tisnelda. Tisnelda was not cruel. I want to be precise here. She was pleasant in the way that certain lobbies are pleasant. Well lit, temperature controlled, designed to make you feel that nothing bad could happen. And her pleasantness had a way of making my own grief feel excessive, theatrical, like wearing a coat indoors. She had a daughter, Zaira, who was 11 when they married, small-boned and serious, with the particular self-sufficiency of children who have learned not to expect much from adults. Zaira called my father Osvaldo for 3 years. Then she started calling him Dad. I noticed the shift the way you notice a picture has been moved on a wall. Not the movement itself, only the pale rectangle where something used to hang. I told myself it was fine. That's the lie you tell yourself in stages, like taking medication. First the small dose, then the larger one, until you cannot remember what the original discomfort felt like. I moved to the coast for work. I managed logistics for a small export company, which is a way of saying I spent my days solving problems nobody wanted to admit were problems. And I came home for holidays and birthdays and the obligatory summer gatherings my father's sister, Eulalia, organized with the precision of a military campaign. It was at one of these that I first noticed the photographs. Not absent, my photographs. Present, but arranged. There is a specific kind of curation that happens in families when someone wants to rewrite the emotional center of gravity, and it is always done through photographs. The one of Osvaldo and me at the bridge construction site in 2009 had been moved to a hallway. The one of Osvaldo, Zaida, and Tusnelda at the coast, taken the previous summer, golden light, everyone squinting, was on the mantelpiece, in the frame that used to hold my mother's portrait. I said nothing. That year, Father's Day fell on a Sunday in June, and Eulalia had organized the dinner at Osvaldo's house. 25 people, 3 generations. My Aunt Perpetua, who smelled of talcum and old arguments. My cousins Wendell and Sigrid, who were 20 and 18 and already moving through the world with the confidence of people who had not yet been seriously disappointed. My father's oldest friend, Galdino, who had known Osvaldo since they were boys, and who still called him by a childhood nickname I had never heard explained. Tusnelda's relatives, 4 or 5 of them, stationed at the far end of the table like a delegation. And Zaira, 14 now, sitting beside my father with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided where she belonged. I arrived late, not deliberately. The traffic on the Karait Bridge had been stopped by a broken-down truck. I remember this detail with absurd clarity, the way trauma sharpens certain edges. And by the time I reached the house, the sun was already falling behind the eucalyptus trees that lined the back fence, and the table was full, and the only empty chair was at the corner, between Wendell and Tusnelda's brother-in-law, a man named Foscolo, who spoke exclusively about real estate. Dinner was long. The food was good. Tusnelda cooked with intention, whatever else I might say about her. And the conversation moved the way conversation does at tables where everyone is performing togetherness. Jokes, anecdotes, the exaggeration of small incidents, the careful avoidance of real ones. Galdino told a story about Osvaldo from their construction days that I had heard 3 times before and laughed at as if I hadn't, because that is what you do. Because the repetition is not the point. Perpetua argued with Wendell about politics and lost without noticing. Foscolo explained that property values in the eastern districts were about to spike, and I nodded and thought about the folder I had left on Rennick's desk, now filed, now official, now irreversible. 2 hours earlier, 40 minutes of highway, 4:47 in the afternoon. The thing you need to understand about what I signed is that it did not come from nowhere. It was the end of a chain of events that had begun, in a way I can trace clearly now, the previous December, when my father called me on a Wednesday evening. Not a special day, not a birthday, a Wednesday, and told me he wanted to talk about his estate. I assumed, the way children always assume too late, that this was a routine conversation, that it would involve some reshuffling of properties, some acknowledgement of the new household he had built with Tusnelda, some measured and equitable arrangement. What he described instead was a complete reconstruction. The house where I had grown up, where my mother had grown her tomatoes in clay pots on the back porch, where I had learned to read and to cry and to hide both, would pass, in its entirety, to Tusnelda upon his death, with the provision that if Tusnelda died before him, it would go to Zaira. My share of the inheritance had been compressed to a savings account and a piece of agricultural land outside Veradal that had not produced anything useful in a decade. He was not apologetic. He was explanatory. He used words like blended family and fairness and current reality, and I listened with the particular stillness of someone trying to determine whether they are being told something that has already happened or something that is still being decided. It had already happened. The documents, he said, were already drafted. I thanked him for telling me. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen in the dark for 2 hours, not crying. I want to be clear about that. I did not cry, but dismantling the structure of every assumption I had made about what I was to him, the way you dismantle a wall to find out why it's damp, pulling out brick after brick until you're standing in a room with no walls at all. Then I called Rennick. Rennick specialized in family law and estate disputes and had the specific affect of someone who had stopped being surprised by human beings a long time ago, which I found comforting. Over the next 6 months, he had worked through a set of documents I had not known existed, documents my mother, Delmira, had created before her death. Documents she had filed quietly and said nothing about to anyone, perhaps because she had known, in the way that dying people sometimes know things, that there would come a moment when I would need them. My mother's family had owned the land in Caraipe Valley since before my parents were married. The house on the back porch, the clay pots, the eucalyptus trees, had been built on land that was hers, that had passed to her from her father, that should have reverted to her direct heirs upon her death. My father had assumed, for 22 years, that a particular clause in the joint title agreement gave him unconditional rights of succession. He had been wrong. The clause was conditional, and the condition, something to do with a joint investment my mother had contributed to independently, something Rennick explained in terms I will not pretend to reproduce accurately, meant that a significant portion of the property rights had remained legally entangled with my mother's estate, and therefore with me. What I signed at 4:47 in the afternoon on Father's Day was not a hostile act. Rennick was careful to explain this, and I believe he was right. It was a claim, a recognition, a legal acknowledgement that I existed in the chain of ownership in a way that my father's new documents had not accounted for, and that any transfer of the property to Tasnelda or Zaira would require my explicit agreement. I was not taking the house. I was simply making it impossible to give it away without asking me first. This is a distinction that matters to me. I want you to understand that. At 6:50 in the evening, after the plates had been cleared and before the cake was brought out, my father, Osvaldo, stood up from his chair at the head of the table. He had not told me he was going to do this. He cleared his throat. The table went quiet in the way it does when someone's posture announces something. He was holding a frame. It was dark wood, narrow, the kind of frame you'd put a diploma in, and inside it was a document. I could not read it from where I was sitting, but I could see it was official, dense with text, formatted the way legal documents are formatted, and at the bottom there were signatures. Osvaldo's and Tusnelda's, and one I could not identify, and Zaira's, her full name. Zaira Conceição Barreiros, in the tentative cursive of someone who has recently been asked to sign something important. He began to speak. He spoke about family, about what it meant to belong somewhere, about the years since he had met Tasnelda, and how she had reminded him that life was not finished, that there was a second chapter available to those willing to turn the page. He spoke about Zaira, about her seriousness, her kindness, her patience with his old habits and worse jokes. And his voice did something I had not heard it do in years, a softening at the edges, a warmth that was not performed. And then he said it. He said that he had legally adopted Zaira, that she was now, on paper and in every way that mattered to him, his daughter. He said, "I finally have the daughter I always deserved." Tasnelda cried, not theatrically. She pressed her fingers against her lips and looked at the ceiling the way people do when they're trying to keep something in. Zaira pushed back her chair and walked around the table and hugged Osvaldo, and he put both arms around her with the ease of someone who had been doing it for years. And Galdino started to clap, and then everyone was clapping, and Perpetua said something that made Wendell laugh, and Foscolo was filming it on his phone, and the sound in that room was warm and full and genuine. Nobody looked at me. Not one person. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it deserves the space. 25 people in a room, and I was one of them. And the thing that was happening, the formal, legal, announced absorption of a new daughter into the place where I had always understood my own daughterness to exist, happened in complete indifference to my presence. I was not ignored the way you ignore someone to punish them. I was ignored the way you ignore a chair. Ambient. Furniture. There. My cousin Sigrid met my eyes for a moment across the table. She is 18 and still has the instinct, before she learns to suppress it, of noticing when something is wrong. She looked at me with the particular alertness of someone who has just sensed a shift in temperature. And then Wendell said something to her, and she turned away, and the moment closed. I picked up my fork. There was a piece of bread on my plate I had not touched. I broke it in half. Osvaldo sat back down, still holding the frame, and Tasnelda took his hand, and Zaira was back in her seat, and everyone was talking again, and someone asked if the cake was ready, and Eulalia went to the kitchen, and the evening continued. I thought about Rennick's desk, the lacquered surface, the folder, the pen. I thought about my mother's handwriting. I thought about what it means to build something, a bridge, a retaining wall, a family, and how the structural integrity of any system depends on what you choose to pretend isn't there. My father had spent years pretending I was fine, that my silence was acceptance, that the photographs on the mantelpiece were just photographs, not arguments, that rewriting the inheritance was a logistical adjustment rather than an act of erasure. He had been very good at it. He had the engineer's confidence in the permanence of what he constructed. What Rennick had found, buried in my mother's files like a load-bearing beam everyone had forgotten to account for, was the reason that confidence was misplaced. When the cake came out, it was mango, Osvaldo's favorite, Tusnelda's gesture, meticulous. I watched my father blow out the candles. He made a wish with his eyes closed. I wondered if he had any idea. I decided he didn't. He would find out through Rennick, through formal channels, through the language of documents rather than the language of dinner tables, because that was the language he had chosen first. I was not glad. I want to say that clearly. There is a version of this story where I am triumphant, where the signing is a victory, where the indifference of 25 people at a table sharpens into something I can use, and I walk away feeling justified. That version is available to me. I have visited it in the way you visit somewhere you know you shouldn't live. But the version I actually occupied, driving back across the Caraipe Bridge in the dark, the valley black and wide below me, the lights of Veredal blinking at the far edge, was smaller and more complicated than triumph. My mother had known. She had filed those documents knowing, with the clarity that dying sometimes brings, that the people we love are also capable of the things we cannot forgive them for. She had not told me. She had left me the ability to protect myself and trusted that I would understand when to use it. That understanding, that she had thought of me quietly in the middle of everything else she was losing, was the thing that finally broke the surface in the car on the bridge. Not anger, not vindication, but something that felt like being found in a room you'd been alone in for a long time. I did not call my father that night. I will not call him tomorrow. Rennick will send a letter, formal, precise, without flourish, and Osvaldo will read it, and he will understand that the house he thought he'd given away is standing on ground that still, legally, remembers my mother. What he does with that understanding is no longer something I can control. I have stopped trying to engineer outcomes in systems that have already decided I am furniture. What I did at 4:47 on a Sunday afternoon was not revenge. It was maintenance. It was taking seriously the structural reality that someone, my mother in her last lucid months, in her particular and precise love for me, had taken seriously first. The bridge held on the drive home. It always does. That is what bridges are for. If this story hit something real in you, like it or subscribe. Someone you know needs to hear this.